April 9, 1891, Boston Evening Transcript, Boston, Massachusetts. Mrs. Annie Besant, who is coming to America to talk about Theosophy. Of Mrs. Annie Besant, the sister-in-law of Walter Besant, the novelist, and who is to make a tour of this country and lecture on Theosophy, a woman who knows her well gives this picture. Fancy yourself pelted by the dismal downpour of a dogged British rain, threading squalid streets suggested of garret robbery, in pitchy darkness broken by the glare of smoky lamps from public house windows, through Old Ford and Tiger Bay, the dreariest sections of the dreary East End. You turn up one dingy court after another, where the houses lean to meet one another overhead, and at the end you climb a tumble-down staircase to the top of a tumble-down building and enter a large, bare room filled with gaunt, ragged women, with kerchiefs knotted loosely about their throats and hair straying into their eyes. Their faces are eager, and 2 or 3 of them talk at once, and they address a tall, slender figure in a softly falling gown of dull gold, cut in quaint, simple fashion. The figure is that of a woman with a fine, intelligent, but rather sad face, with large eyes, sweet mouth, and dark, wavy hair. It is Monday night, and the regular meeting of a newly organized women's trade union is in progress. It is not very interesting in itself, except as it gives one a chance to study the woman against whom her husband's brother, Mr. Walter Besant, has prejudice so inveterate that he is credited with trying to obscure the family connection by accenting his name on the second syllable, as she accents hers on the first. It is a curious life she has had, married to a clergyman of the established church, separated from him by atheistic views acquired at 22, her children taken away from her and all communication with them forbidden, associated with Bradlaugh in writing earnestly, if often indiscreetly, against certain conventional forms, lecturing, disputing with Francis Power Cobb, editing socialistic papers and pamphlets, estranged of late from many of her friends of years by her connection with Madame Blavatsky. From one thing to another she has hurried, seeming always heart-hungry, looking for something to take the place of the old faith and the old affections. One hears her called a dangerous person, alien to church and state, and one also hears the woman who, in the old days, was governess to her children, call her the loveliest lady in England. These working women, pale, thin, undersized, looking to her for help and counsel, seem more inclined to agree with the last opinion than with the first. When she organized Bryant and May's Match Girls 2 years ago, she did as practical a thing as has been done for London working girls. People say Madame Blavatsky has been a drain on her purse for some time now, but much of her money still goes to the poor of Marylebone and other parishes. A few weeks ago, I visited her at the villa in St. John's Wood, where she lives with Madame Blavatsky. People say she pays the running expenses of the establishment and supports the fleshy priestess, but of that I know nothing. The place is a double house of an old-fashioned substantial variety set in a pretty garden. It is a kind of hotel or guide and chaperone bureau for theosophists, and a dozen or more make it their headquarters. On the evening I called, Madame Blavatsky sat on a low oriental-looking couch, heaped with Turkish cushions, and looked mountainous in a long, loose robe of dull orange, like a sheet with a hole in the middle, as she smoked cigarettes, which she rolled for herself moodily and said nothing. There were screen arrangements about her to shut her off in a sort of recess or shrine if she did not choose to mix with the company. Her semi-seclusion was effective, but not too effective. Any straining would have spoiled the whole. The room was very pretty, with hangings of dull red and dark blue. There were decorations of storks and other creatures theosophical, a good many books, and some porcelains. It was all very homelike and pleasant, and Madame Blavatsky's lines seemed to have fallen to her in delightful places. Mrs. Besant acted as hostess, and there was some good conversation. The magazine, which Mrs. Besant and Madame Blavatsky edit, and which is called Lucifer, is seen now and then in the libraries of New Yorkers of an inquiring turn of mind, as well as their theosophical siftings. Mrs. Besant said very little of her trip to America, but I gathered that Madame Blavatsky feels very bitter over her denunciation on this side of the water as a humbug and a deceiver, and that Mrs. Besant is, in a sense, sent out as a vindicator. New York Recorder. July 7, 1911. Votes for Women. Self-sacrifice or revolution? On Sunday, July 2, Mrs. Annie Besant delivered the fourth out of a series of 5 lectures to a crowded and enthusiastic audience at the Queen's Hall. Mrs. Besant showed that the vast social problems today demand a solution which must take one of 2 directions, that of self-sacrifice or revolution. 3 prominent features of the day point this moral: the great pageants of the past fortnight, the industrial strikes, and the advance of aviation. The pageants have produced the feeling of union and devotion. Strikes are a direct exemplum of the revolutionary spirit abroad. The modern triumphs of science, as exemplified in aviation, have not yet been as productive of good as they should be, because they are not yet applied to the commonweal. The solution of the present situation must lie in self-sacrifice and a stirring of conscience. Having illustrated the danger of a lowering of ideals from the 2 former great civilizations of India and the feudal system, Mrs. Besant went on in a wonderful exordium to declare that in the utmost service is the most perfect freedom. The thought roused in a suffragist mind was that such is the ideal of women. They seek enfranchisement in order to give their full powers to the community. We conquer, but to serve. E.W.D. August 30, 1926. The Evening Independent, St. Petersburg, Florida. Advent of a Timid Deity by Leon M. Seiler, NEA service writer, New York, August 30. Jiddu Krishnamurti, the occult vehicle of God, little relishes playing that curiosity-challenging role in boisterous, irreverent, skeptical America. The vehicle came to New York with cold sweat on his thin, pinched brow. He came with a quavering voice, with nervously twitching hands, with a longing, obviously, to be elsewhere, say back in one of his retreats in India. He came with few words to phrase his message, words spoken in excellent English, to be sure, but spoken with faltering reluctance. The vehicle is alarmed lest people misunderstand. He is devastated when addressed as New Christ or Messiah, for he is but a vehicle, that's all. Jiddu hovers close to his venerable sponsor and foster mother, Mrs. Annie Besant. It was Mrs. Besant, leader of one faction of the Theosophists of the world, who first saw vehicular possibilities in the fragile young Brahmin. She took him under her matronly wing and trained him in the way she thought the potential incarnation of the Nameless One should go. Chicago is to be honored with the first formal appearance of Mrs. Besant and the vehicle in their American sojourn. Chicago receives them as the outstanding delegates to a national convention of Mrs. Besant's theosophical followers. Then, for Mrs. Besant, a lecture tour is to ensue. Krishnamurti will be immured in California the while. Whether there will be public exemplifications of Jiddu's vehicular divinity may depend on the response which Mrs. Besant's lectures evoke. There are but loosely drawn lines about the quality of doctrine and creed which Krishnamurti advocates. Largely, it is a gospel of brotherhood, tolerance, Samaritanism, and desirelessness. There is a jolt in its desirelessness phase for those whose Christianity is more ancient of days, for Krishnamurti would not have the individual desire, even to go to heaven. But those who can't quite see their way clear to putting away all selfish desire receive from him no criticism. Krishnamurti is non-critical. They talk of American life as being jazzy, pleasure-loving. Yes, he hazards when hard-pressed. I think that to want nothing for self, to want only for others, is more important, but I do not condemn. Do you understand? The eyes of this timorous evangel from the Himalayas come nearest in his outward makeup to impressing the uninitiated. Dark, lustrous eyes, they flash with eager animation at such times as Krishnamurti is able to loose his tongue. But these times were few during the early hours of his present American visitation. This vehicle of God, one gathers, will suffer many pangs if he is called on while here to face in the flesh the barrages of 1926 dubiety and skepticism.